David, thank you for coming to Toronto for this important debate. It is the kind of issue of the moment. Let's start just by having you define some terms here so that
Yes.
people understand the context within which this debate is happening. You're going to argue in favor of small L liberal values. Can you explain to me what those are for you? Because I think there's a confusion out there. People hear liberal, they think capital L, they think a political party. They don't think a kind of canon of foundational values.
We have a vocabulary problem in modern politics. So I'm a conservative most of the time, but what do conservatives seek to conserve? What is the thing we inherited from the past that we are trying to protect? And that thing that we are trying to conserve is, we're not trying to conserve the Spanish Inquisition. We're not trying to conserve Versailles and absolute monarchy. We're not trying to conserve Neanderthal cave art, attractive as it is. What we're trying to conserve is the liberal inheritance of the past 200 years. The ideas of the equal worth of the individual, the idea that the state should be representative of the people, that those who hold power are accountable to those who confer power. We are trying to conserve the rule of law, limited government. By the way, market economics and free trade as well. And we are especially trying to conserve a bunch of institutions that were created after World War II to make sure that the world never underwent a catastrophe like that again. Institutions that were supposed to mediate the differences between nations and make sure that the zone of peace and like-mindedness was growing ever bigger.
How do you see this kind of outbreak of populism, not just here in North America, but now increasingly around the world, as a threat to those small L liberal values?
Well, populism is an even more troubling word than liberalism is, and it has meant many, many more different things in many more different places. And we use it mostly as a courtesy because the people who espouse this politics, that's what they tend to call themselves. The difference in populism and democracy, I mean, who could be against populism, an idea that speaks for the people? But populism always begins by taking a group of people and subdividing it, saying this group of people, because of their skin, because of their religion, because of some other factor, they're not whom we mean by the people. The foundation of politics is a subdivision of the nation between the people who belong and the people who do not belong. Now, this idea has also got a history. And
that's saying something lightly.
It's also got a history.
Yeah.
And because we live in a gentler world than our parents and grandparents did, that although you can often see a lot of family resemblance to the fascism of the 1930s and 40s in the populism of today, it's much less violent, it's much less dangerous, much less virulent, at least to now. And so, as a courtesy, you use the term that the people use for themselves.
So the alternative might be authoritarian, fascist. There's this word nationalist. Your opponent tonight likes to call himself an economic nationalist. How would you define that?
Well, again, that's a word I'm not sure what that means. If what nationalism means, however, nationalism can mean a couple of things. One is it can believe that you can enhance the economic well-being of a nation by sealing it off from trade, in which case I would just call that uninformed. That's just an intellectual error. But if you cannot do that, the nations that have tried it are poor. They're not pursuing welfare. But if what it means is that you envision a world of states in which the interests of states are in conflict, and that the project of harmonizing interests from nation state to nation state is a fool's errand, and that the truth is that nations compete aggressively against one another, both in the sphere of economics and in other spheres, then I say let us be mindful of where this idea leads. Because it is just not true that you can see the world of commerce as competitive, as an area in which one nation's advantage comes at the expense of another, and limit that view only to commerce. Sooner or later, this puts you on the path not just to trade war, but to real war.
Mm-hmm. You have written powerfully in your latest book, Trumpocracy, about how this new moment of populism has this kleptocratic, I don't know, overture, underture, you define it, but there's something new here about how it's manifesting itself early on in the 21st century.
Well, outside the Islamic world, the 21st century is not an age of strong ideology. We do not have the kind of demented idealism that you saw in the time of Stalin and Mao and Castro and Hitler. The modern authoritarians don't have big ideas, and again you see they're in it to steal. That's one of the things that these nationalist heroes all have in common. They're all crooks. Viktor Orban is plundering Hungary on a post-Soviet scale. The National Front in France finances itself by a combination of dirty loans from Russia and fraudulently using its European Union parliamentary accounts. The new government of Italy is caught up in a giant fundraising scandal. And of course, Trump himself is the least ethical, least honest president in American history. And not just him, but his cabinet are just mired in conflicts of interest. So the populism also becomes a tool. You rev up not only people's hatred against others, but their loyalty to you. And that enables you to steal from them and leaves them defenseless even to notice what's happening.
Let me try out on you a couple of the arguments that surround this debate. The first is that politics has fundamentally changed, that in this age of exploding economic inequality, the axis of politics is indeed the elite versus the people. It's no longer right versus left. It's no longer different interpretations of the liberal canon.
Yeah.
Do you accept that politics has changed this way and that tendency will only get worse?
Politics always changes. Politics is the art of governing human beings, and the questions are never the same, and the challenges are never the same. And that's especially true in an era of rapid technological change. And what I certainly do agree with is that the inherited arguments of left versus right from a previous era have become out of date, because they're arguments about things that people don't worry about so much anymore. And I would argue as well that extreme inequality does create challenges to the liberal order, because it means that there are people who have power that in a liberal state nobody should have. You know, when I was studying Roman history as a boy, there's this famous line from one of the Roman oligarchs who said, no one should be considered rich unless he can afford to field a private army. Now, in 1972, that seemed like a pretty laughable idea. But in 2018, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg could afford to field a private army. Lots of people can afford to do that. And we do live in a world of oligarchs. We live in a world of individuals who are as powerful as states. So that's not a brand new challenge. I mean, that's the problem that liberalism had at the beginning, back in the 18th century, when it had to confront these extraordinarily powerful monarchs and aristocrats who were stronger than the rest of the society put together. How do you apply the rule of law to such people? It's a real problem. But it's not a brand new problem, and it's not a problem that invalidates the approach. We have to treat people with dignity. We have to have a state that answers to the governed.
Steve Bannon argues vociferously that the liberal elite order has lost its political base, that it either ignored or just didn't choose to care about the hollowing out of the industrial heartland. It went off and fought a series of wars, the cost of trillions of dollars and tens of thousands hurt and injured at home. In effect, the debate's over because the liberal order can no longer recreate a large base, an electorate that's going to support these ideals because it squandered its own political capital.
Well, that is an assessment with a lot of validity to it. That's a true observation. It's not a true recommendation. You know, as I will say tonight, Steve Bannon and I have met once before. We met a decade ago. And I was a participant in a film of his. And we discussed just this topic. I was writing a lot about this, even before the financial crisis, that conservative politics had drifted away from the interests of the country. And Bannon saw it too. And we both realized that the conservative politics as we'd known it had become obsolete. And now the question is, once you see that, what do you do? Do you try to reform, or do you take advantage of that fragility to overthrow, or to try to overthrow a system? So it's quite right that across the democratic world we have seen that the order built since 1945 has lost some of its popularity, some of its legitimacy. And there are reasons why that's so. So let's correct the reasons, because the alternative is not passive. The alternative is that people are saying, right, there's a loss of popularity here. That's an opportunity for somebody to do something very dangerous.
And do you at this moment see the people who are exploiting that opportunity as responsible for this uptick in political violence, the increase of number of incidences of white supremacist terror in different Western countries around the world? Is it right to correlate those two?
I want to be very precise in how I answer this. And we can look at specific incidents. I mean, I think it is fair to hold President Trump very much to account for this incident of pipe bombing. The pipe bomber, who was someone who'd been not political before Donald Trump came on the scene, was politicized by Donald Trump, was an enormous enthusiast for Donald Trump, and chose his targets precisely according to the list that Donald Trump had given out. The people Donald Trump identified as his enemies became the pipe bomber's enemies, and he tried more or less wholeheartedly to murder them. I think Donald Trump needs to examine his conscience about all of that. I don't think we do generally live in a time of increasing violence. I mean, I think that one of the things that characterizes our time is across the board, we live in a much less violent age than people did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. That's one of the reasons why people are tempted by this new kind of so-called populist politics. The people who experienced the high-octane version of this kind of politics back in the 30s and 40s knew how deadly it was. It led to murder, it led to war, it led to conflict, it led to cities that were 18 inches high. And they said, we will never, ever taste this poison again. But time passes and people forget, and then you get a milder version of the same thing. And it doesn't look as violent. And in fact, many of its advocates would insist, well, we're not violent. Mm-hmm. We just want to have a little of the old poison.
Where does this debate go from here? You're arguing tonight that the future of Western politics indeed can have a liberal future. What makes you optimistic about that? Do you think it's a question of liberal internationalism becoming more effective, repositioning itself? Or is it a case of populism burning itself out? What makes you hopeful about the future?
The populists have no solutions. They don't care to have solutions. They don't even understand what a solution would look like. One of the things that is remarkable in the Trump era is you take the two things that made Donald Trump, that were his hardest themes, economic conflict with China and immigration. You know what? Donald Trump in 2018 will run a bigger trade deficit with China specifically than the United States has run in a decade. And what he doesn't understand is that the tariffs he applied, any Econ 101 student could have told us, when you apply a lot of tariffs from the United States on China, what happens is the US dollar goes up and the Chinese currency goes down. And China's competitiveness is enhanced by the very things you try to do to punish China, bigger deficit. In the same way, President Trump has ran very hard on the theme of immigration. Well, guess what? In 2018, illegal immigration will run faster than it did in the last 2 years of the Obama presidency. Same thing. Donald Trump he can brutalize people and insult and abuse them, but he doesn't have answers. So I think that's the first vulnerability of populist politics. Second is it is so corrupt and so flagrantly corrupt, and people will, not the core constituents, but people will see it. Donald Trump is the least ethical president ever, and that offends people, and his cabinet is the least ethical cabinet in a long time. And people will see that. And they see the corruption as it happens in all of these other, with the little Trumps across Europe. And then I think what will also happen is, it's unfortunate. There's this saying, it's good to learn from experience. It's better to learn from other people's experience. But this may be one where we have to taste a little of this to remind ourselves why our parents and grandparents said, please, never again.
So just finally, then the future of these small L liberal values, do you think they are going to change? Do you think there's a need, I don't know, to look at greater redistribution of wealth, policies that are more focused on fairer trade as opposed to laissez-faire trade? What is it, David? Is there a recalibration that has to happen there too?
Anybody who thinks that what politics is going to the library, pulling the volume of Friedrich Hayek or John Maynard Keynes and searching through the index, answers to the problems to questions they never thought of 100 years ago, and that's not how it works. What these traditions do is they give you ways of thinking, and they give you values and guidelines. So we have now got this extraordinary accumulation of private wealth. That does challenge the liberal project. And it's not obvious what to do about it, because the answers that a socialist would have, or that a communist would have, or that an authentic fascist would have are not available. And in some countries, the problem is at the same time, and this is especially true in Europe, you have a problem of very sluggish local economies that don't create enough jobs. So it's both true that if in France what you need to do is a lot of deregulation to create employment and opportunity and get the economy moving. In the United States, you may need a thicker social insurance network to assure people that if through no fault of their own they get sick or lose their job or are old, that they have less to fear. we are going to have to think about how world trade works with the rise of China. It was always true in the past that the established trading powers were so rich and so strong that they could say to any newcomer, here are the rules, you must obey. When you get a newcomer that is as big and powerful as China, you can't so easily tell them what the rules are. They have opinions back, and they command a lot of authority. The liberal politics of the 21st century is going to have to be rethought, and the liberal tradition, I should say. And so this, as I believe it is, this recession, this democratic recession we've had since 2005, this may be the period in which we do the rethinking. And what I hope is that our children and our grandchildren look back and say, that was a dangerous period, and you all nearly made some very fatal mistakes. But you acted in time, you saw the danger, you corrected your own mistakes, and you reaffirmed the great tradition that has served peace and prosperity so well.
You may have already answered my question, but what do you want, or what do you hope comes out of this debate? There's been a lot of contention, there's been a lot of debate around the debate.
Yes.
You were really committed at the very beginning of us talking about this, of having this conversation, as difficult as it was going to be. Why?
Well, I will open tonight's debate by answering just that question. But to anticipate a little bit, I have different answers for different people, but maybe the most important thing is, like, the people on my side of this argument, we've been losing. We've been losing for a while. And since 2014, it's been one retreat after another, including in the very heartland of the country we look to defend and uphold, is the United States. I think there's a lot of anxiety, maybe a lot of discouragement, some defeatism. And what I want to say tonight is, be not afraid. That it is true that things have been going ill. They are going to begin to go better. And it's not too late. You can act. If you act now, you can turn this dynamic around. You can change this reality. The world is full of thugs and bullies and crooks who claim to be the wave of the future. They were wrong in 1942. They're wrong now.